I accidentally sent my cold thesis advisor a voice message about my crush. She played it in her office and smiled GL book. Let me say that title one more time. I accidentally sent my cold thesis advisor a voice message about my crush. She played it in her office and she smiled. Now, before you close this and pretend you have never done something embarrassing in your life, I want you to stay. Because this story is not just about the most mortifying 63 seconds of audio I have ever recorded. It is about what happened after, about the woman on the other end of that message, about what it looks like when the most intimidating person in your world hears your most private thought and does not use it against you. This story is about the moment I stopped calling what I felt intellectual admiration and started calling it what it actually was. Stay with me. Because the embarrassing part is only the beginning. My name is Layla Nasser. I am 24 years old. I am a second-year graduate student in comparative literature at Whitmore University. Study the way stories are told across cultures. How the same human feelings get dressed up in different languages and different time periods and different forms, but underneath they are always the same feelings. Love loss, the fear of being seen, the desperate need to be seen anyway. I study this professionally. I write papers about it. I can identify the emotional core of a 19th century Russian novel in 45 minutes and explain it clearly in academic language that sounds very impressive at department meetings. And yet for 8 months I could not identify the emotional core of what was happening inside my own chest every time my thesis advisor walked into a room. I called it intellectual admiration. I told my best friend Cleo I called it intellectual admiration. Cleo said, Layla. I said, what? She said, you reorganized your entire research schedule so you would pass her office at the same time every morning. I said, I reorganized my schedule for efficiency. Cleo said, you do not drink coffee, but you started going to the coffee machine on the 4th floor. I said, I needed a change of environment. Cleo said, her office is on the 4th floor. I said, that is a coincidence. Cleo looked at me for a very long time. She said, you have intellectual admiration for a woman whose office floor you have memorized and whose schedule you have rearranged your life around. I says yes. Cleo says, okay, Layla. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. My thesis advisor was Dr. Serena Malik. She was 38 years old. She had a PhD from Cambridge. She had published 3 books that were used in graduate programs at 11 different universities. She had won 2 major academic awards that I had looked up more times than I would like to admit. She had dark hair that she wore up almost always, and when it was down, it was a different kind of alarming. She had the kind of face that looked like it was always thinking something more interesting than whatever was being said out loud. She was cold in the specific way of someone who was not actually cold, but who had learned to keep a professional distance so complete that warmth from her felt like a rare thing when it appeared. She was demanding in the way of someone who believed you were capable of more than you were currently doing, and was not going to pretend otherwise to make you feel comfortable. She made every student in her program better at their work. She also made every student in her program slightly terrified. When she had been assigned as my thesis advisor in September, I had felt 2 things simultaneously. The first thing was the particular academic thrill of being assigned to the most rigorous and respected advisor in the department. The second thing was something I filed immediately under intellectual admiration and put in a drawer and tried very hard not to take out again. I took it out again approximately every 3 days. The tutoring sessions were on Thursdays at 3 o'clock. Her office was on the 4th floor. It had 2 walls of bookshelves and 1 wall of windows that looked out over the campus courtyard, and a desk that was always organized in a way that suggested every object on it was exactly where it was supposed to be. She had a plant on the windowsill that was thriving, which I noticed because thriving plants meant consistent attention, which meant she was someone who remembered to take care of things, which was information I put in the drawer with the other information. The sessions were 1 hour. She spent the first 15 minutes on whatever chapter I had submitted that week. Her feedback was always specific, never vague encouragement. Never the soft kind of criticism that softens itself into meaninglessness. She said exactly what was wrong and exactly what it needed and why the current version was not there yet. The first time she did this, I went home and stared at my annotated chapter for an hour feeling completely leveled. Then I rewrote it. The second version was significantly better. I knew it was better because when I submitted it, she said, "This is closer," which from Dr. Malik was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. I started working harder than I had ever worked in my academic life. Not because I was afraid of her criticism, because I wanted to hear that word again, closer. And then the next word after that. This is, looking back, extremely revealing. At the time I called it academic motivation. Cleo called it something else. Cleo was wrong, I told her. Cleo did not argue. She had learned that arguing with me about this particular subject was not productive. She had adopted a policy of making one observation and then waiting. She had a lot of patience. She had been waiting since October. It was a Tuesday in February when it happened. I was on the train. 40 minutes. The long route, because the short route had engineering works, and I had been rerouted through a part of the city I did not know well, and was consequently sitting on a train that smelled like someone's takeaway dinner at 6 in the evening, feeling sorry for myself. I had just come from the department library where I had spent 4 hours on a chapter that was not working. The argument was right, the evidence was there. But the writing kept doing the thing where it sounded like an essay pretending to be a thesis chapter instead of a thesis chapter that had earned its own authority. Dr. Malik had said this to me at last Thursday's session. She had not said it unkindly. She had said, "This reads like you are trying to convince yourself as much as the reader. Stop trying to convince, just argue. You know the argument, trust it." I had thought about that sentence approximately 40 times in the 5 days since. I was thinking about it on the train when Cleo called. Cleo said, "How was the library?" I said, "Terrible. The chapter is still doing the essay thing." Cleo said, "What did she say about it last week?" I said, "She said I need to stop convincing and start arguing." Cleo said, "That is actually good advice," I said. "It is perfect advice. That is the problem. Everything she says is exactly right, and I spend the whole week thinking about it. And then I get to the session and she says something new that is also exactly right, and it is honestly a lot." Cleo said, "Tell me more about the honestly a lot part," I said. Cleo. Cleo said, "I am just asking." I said, "She walked into the session last week and her hair was down." Cleo said nothing. This was tactical. Cleo knew when to be quiet, I said. "It is usually up. She wears it up." And it was down, and she had been at a faculty event in the morning, so she was wearing a different kind of outfit than usual. And she came in and she looked, and she said, "Good afternoon, Layla," and I forgot what chapter we were on. Cleo said, "You forgot what chapter you were on," I said, for approximately 4 seconds. Cleo said, "Layla," I said, intellectual admiration. Cleo said, "You forgot what chapter you were on." I remembered. Cleo said, "You forgot." I said, "For 4 seconds." And then I remembered, and the session was completely normal and productive. Cleo said, "You are so far gone." I said, "I am intellectually." And then the train went through a tunnel and the call dropped. I looked at my phone. The call had ended. I had Cleo's message thread open from where I had been trying to call back. I held down the microphone button and recorded what I was going to send her. I said, "I know what you think and you are wrong. It is not what you think it is." I look at her and I think about her arguments and her feedback and the way she explains things. And yes, sometimes I think about her hair. And yes, sometimes I think about the fact that she has a plant that is thriving and what that means about what kind of person she is. And yes, I reorganized my schedule to walk past her office in the mornings. But that because her light is on early makes me want to work harder, and that is intellectual admiration, Cleo, and not whatever thing you are implying. And I would appreciate it if you stopped implying is. And I would appreciate it if you stopped implying it. I pressed send. I put my phone in my bag. I looked out the train window at the dark tunnel, giving way to the lit city. Then I took my phone out of my bag. The message had not gone to Cleo. It had gone to the contact directly above Cleo in my recent messages, Dr. S. Malik. I sat on the train for the remaining 22 minutes of my journey, completely unable to move. If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever sent a message to the wrong person, I need you to understand that this was the specific category of wrong person that makes that experience look mild. This was not texting your mother something meant for a friend. This was not a work email sent to the wrong colleague. This was a 63-second voice message about having intellectual admiration for my thesis advisor. Sent to my thesis advisor at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening. Keep listening. Because I promise you the next part is where this story actually begins. I did not sleep that night. I considered several options: withdrawing from the program, transferring to a different university, moving to a country where Dr. Serena Malik did not exist, and could not have heard a voice message that I had sent her explaining that her thriving plant was evidence of what kind of person she was. I considered all of these options seriously between the hours of 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. By 4 a.m. I had arrived at a different conclusion. The message had been sent. It could not be unsent. I had two choices. I could not show up to Thursday's session, which would be its own kind of disaster, because my thesis defense was in 4 months, and I could not afford to lose momentum. Or I could show up to Thursday's session and face whatever happened with as much dignity as a person could have in this situation. I chose dignity. I chose it while feeling completely undignified, but I chose it. Thursday came. I wore my most professional outfit. I had my notes organized in a way that suggested someone completely in control of their academic life. I knocked on the door of her fourth-floor office at 3 o'clock exactly, she said. Come in. She was at her desk, hair up, the plant on the windowsill looking healthy. 2 cups of tea on the desk, which was unusual. She usually had one. I sat down in the chair across from her. I put my notes on the desk. I was preparing to say something that I had rehearsed approximately 40 times, something professional and brief that acknowledged the message and moved us past it efficiently. She said, before we begin. I stopped. She opened her desk drawer. She took out her phone. She looked at me with an expression I could not read. She said, I want you to know that I listened to the message you sent on Tuesday. The room was very quiet. She said, I also want you to know that I am not going to pretend I did not receive it. Because I think pretending would be unkind, and I do not want to be unkind to you. I said, Doctor Malik, I can explain, she said. You do not need to explain. She put her phone back in the drawer. You sent me something private by accident. That happens. What I want to say is that the message was honest, and it was kind, and nothing you said in it changes my professional opinion of you or your work. She looked at me directly. Are we clear on that? I said, yes. She said, good. She picked up the chapter I had submitted now. The argument in section 3 is significantly stronger than last week. You stopped convincing and started arguing. Well done. I sat across from her, and she critiqued my chapter, and I took notes, and the session ran for 1 hour exactly as it always did. She did not mention the message again. And at the end of the session, when I was gathering my notes to leave, I looked up, and she was looking out the window at the courtyard below. And there was something on her face. Not nothing, something, the corner of her mouth, just slightly, just for 1 moment. Like a thought she had decided not to finish out loud. She smiled. I called Cleo from the pavement outside the building. I said, she smiled. Cleo said, who smiled? I said, Dr. Malik. She played the message. She told me she was not going to pretend she did not receive it. She said nothing in the message changed her professional opinion of me. And then she critiqued my chapter for an hour, and at the end she smiled. Cleo was quiet. Then she said, Layla. I said, I know. She said, you need to be very careful. I said, I know. She said, she is your thesis advisor. I said, I know, Cleo. She said, there are rules. I said, I am aware of the rules, she said, and you are going to follow the rules. I said, of course I am going to follow the rules. She said, okay. I said, but she smiled. Cleo said, I know, go home. I went home. I sat at my desk. I opened my thesis chapter. I wrote 4 pages in 2 hours that were the best 4 pages I had written since September. The weeks after that were a specific kind of slow, not bad slow. The kind of slow where everything has a texture you were not previously aware of. Where you notice things you walked past before. Where ordinary interactions have a quality they did not have before because something has shifted and you cannot unshift it. Nothing changed in the sessions. She was professional. She was demanding. She said things like, the secondary argument here undermines the primary one, restructure, and the transition between these sections is losing the reader. Fix it, and this is better. Keep going. But there were small things. The second cup of tea was there every Thursday. She never mentioned it. I never mentioned it, I drank it. It was the right kind, which meant she had noted at some point what kind I drank. Once in the middle of a session, she stopped and said, have you eaten today? I said, yes, mostly. She said, mostly is not a complete answer. I said, I had lunch. She said, what time? I said, 11. She said, it is 4:30. I said, I lost track of time in the library. She looked at me for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and put a cereal bar on the desk between us. She said, Section 4. What is the argument? I ate the cereal bar. We continued the session. At the door on the way out, I said, thank you for the tea and the cereal bar. She said, you cannot do good academic work if you are not taking basic care of yourself. It is practical, I said. Of course. She said, good night, Layla. I said, good night, Dr. Malik. I went down the stairs instead of the elevator, so I had more time before I had to be in the outside world again. Are you still here? Good, because this is the part where the story gets harder, and more honest, and more real, because it would not be a true story if I told you it was only soft things. The tea and the cereal bar and the corner of her mouth, there was also the harder part. The part where I had to sit with what was true and decide what to do with it. The thesis conflict happened in March, 2 months before my defense. I submitted the central chapter, the most important one, the one that the whole argument of the thesis rested on. I had worked on it for 3 weeks. I thought it was ready. She did not think it was ready. She sit down, Layla. I sat down. I looked at her face, and I knew before she spoke that this was not a session where she was going to say closer. She said, this chapter is not ready for defense. I said, I understand there are things to fix, she said. It is not a matter of fixing. The central claim is sound, the research is thorough. But the argument loses confidence in the final third. You are writing like you do not fully believe the conclusion you are drawing. I said, I believe the conclusion. She said, the writing does not. She put the chapter on the desk between us. She said, tell me the conclusion out loud. Not the written version, just tell me, I told her. She said, yes, that is the argument. Now why does the chapter stop doing that in the final third? I said, I do not know. She said, I think you do know. I think something happened between the second third and the final third, and I think it is not a writing problem. I looked at her. She said, is there something affecting your work that you have not told me about? I said, no. She said, Layla, I said nothing. She said, I am asking as your advisor. If there is something that is making it difficult to complete this work, I need to know about it so I can help you. That is my job. I said, there is nothing wrong with my work. She said, there is something wrong with this chapter. I said, then tell me what to fix. She said, I cannot tell you what to fix because it is not a technical problem. It is a confidence problem, and those come from somewhere. I looked at the chapter on the desk between us, the 3 weeks of work, the argument I had built carefully, and then somewhere in the final third had started to undermine. I said quietly, I know the argument is right. I know the conclusion is correct. She waited. I said, Sometimes I sit at my desk and I think about everything that is going on, and I cannot separate it from the work. And the work starts to sound like everything else. Uncertain, she said. What is everything else? I said, just things, she said. Layla, look at me. I looked at her. She said, you are one of the most capable students I have advised in 12 years. The argument in this thesis is original, and it is correct, and it is going to contribute something real to this field. I need you to believe that, not because I said it. Because it is true, and you built it and it belongs to you. I pressed my lips together. She said, whatever else is making you uncertain right now, it does not change that. The work is real. Do you hear me? I said, yes. She said, do you believe me? I said, I want to. She said, that is enough for today. Come back next Thursday, and we will work through the final third together. I said, okay. I got up to leave. At the door, she said, Layla. I turned, she said, the things, whatever they are. I hope they become clearer. She was looking at me with the expression I had been collecting all year. The one that lived underneath the professional distance. The one that was not cold at all. I said, thank you, Dr. Malik. I went down the stairs again, all 4 flights. Cleo was waiting outside. I had not told her I needed her to be there. She had been there anyway because that was what Cleo did. She looked at my face. She said, library. Now we went to the library. We sat in the back corner where no one ever was. She put a sandwich in front of me that she had apparently been carrying in her bag on the possibility that I would need it. I said. She said I am one of the most capable students she has advised in 12 years. Cleo said, okay, I said, and she said the work is real and it belongs to me. Cleo said, that is true, I said, and she told me she hopes the things become clearer. Cleo said, what things? I said, everything that is making the chapter uncertain. Cleo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Layla, you have to tell her. I said, tell her what? Cleo said, that the thing making the chapter uncertain is her. I said, I cannot tell her that. Cleo said, I know you cannot tell her right now. There are rules, and they are right rules, and you are going to follow them. But you have to deal with this honestly, because it is sitting inside your thesis, and she can see it even if she does not know exactly what it is. I said she cannot see it. Cleo said, she literally just told you the chapter loses confidence in the final third, and asked what is going on with you. She can see it. I ate the sandwich. I looked at the library ceiling. I said, what do I do? Cleo said, you finish the thesis, you defend it, you do it properly and by the rules, and then. I said, and then. She said, and then you figure out what honest looks like when there are no more rules in the way. The late-night library session was in April, 3 weeks before defense. I had been in the library since noon. It was 11 at night. I should have gone home 4 hours ago, but the chapter was finally doing the right thing and I did not want to stop. I heard footsteps. She was carrying a tote bag, and she was still in her work clothes, which meant she had been at the university late. She stopped when she saw me. She said, it is 11 o'clock, I said, I know. She said, the library closes at midnight. I said, I know, I am almost done. She looked at the pages spread across the table, the annotated printouts, the notes in the margins. She said, may I? She sat down. She looked at the pages I indicated. She read for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. I watched her read. The particular quality of her attention when it was fully on something. Then she looked up. She said, this is it. I said, what? She said, this is the chapter. This is the argument doing what it is supposed to do. What changed? I said, I stopped being uncertain, she said. About the argument. I said, about all of it. She looked at me. I said, you told me the work is real and it belongs to me. And I decided to believe you. Something moved in her expression. She said, good. We sat in the library for another 40 minutes. She went through the chapter with me. She said 3 times that it was right. Once she said excellent, which I had never heard from her before, and which landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. At 10 to midnight, she said, you should go, last train. I said, yes. I was packing my bag when I said, Dr. Malik. She looked up. I said, I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it professionally, and then we can both not mention it again. She was very still. I said, I am aware of the professional situation. I am aware of the rules, and I think the rules are right rules, and I have followed them, and I am going to keep following them until my defense is done and everything is clear. But I wanted you to know that whatever I said in that voice message in February, I have not stopped meaning it. And the chapter being better is partly because I decided to stop pretending I did not mean it. The library was very quiet. She said, Layla. I said, you do not have to say anything. I just needed to say it. She said, I know. I said, good night, Dr. Malik. She said, good night, Layla. I went to the last train. I sat in the corner and I felt lighter than I had in 4 months. Not because anything had changed. Because I had said something true out loud, and it had not destroyed anything. Sometimes that is enough. If you are still here, I want to tell you that the next part matters most. Because the story could have stopped there. The confession in the library. The chapter getting better. The defense coming up. It could have been a story about a feeling that was acknowledged, and then put away because the rules were right rules. But it did not stop there. My thesis defense was on a Tuesday in May. I was in a room with 5 faculty members, including Dr. Malik, who was there as my advisor, and who was the only one in the room whose opinion I had been working toward for 8 months. I defended for 2 hours. They asked hard questions. I answered them, not perfectly. 2 of the answers I would rephrase if I could, but I argued, not convinced, argued, the way she had told me to. When they came back in after deliberation, the department chair said, Congratulations, Dr. Nasser. I heard that word, doctor, my new word. I looked at Dr. Malik. She was not smiling the corner of mouth smile. She was smiling completely, the full thing. Looking at me like she had been waiting for this specific moment. Congratulations, she said. The work is excellent, I said. Thank you, she said. I mean it, I said. I know. 3 days after the defense, the formal process was complete. My grades were submitted. My thesis was filed. Dr. Serena Malik was no longer my thesis advisor. I had submitted a formal request to change to a different advisor 6 weeks earlier, when I understood where things were going and understood that the right thing to do was to make sure the professional relationship was clean before anything else could be considered. She had approved the request without comment. I did not know if that meant she understood why. I chose to believe she did. 2 weeks after the defense, I was in the campus courtyard on a Thursday afternoon. It was raining the way May sometimes rained, like it could not quite decide if it wanted to be winter still. She was crossing the courtyard. She saw me. She stopped. We looked at each other across the rainy courtyard, then she walked toward me. She stopped in front of me. The rain was coming down, and neither of us had an umbrella. She said, I reviewed the change of advisor request when you submitted it. I said, I know you did. She said, I want you to know that I understood why you submitted it. I said, I thought you might. She said, I also want to tell you something that I could not tell you before because the professional situation did not allow it. I waited, she said. The voice message you sent in February, I did not just listen to it once. I looked at her. She said, I am telling you this because I think honesty matters. And because you were honest with me in the library in April, and you deserved honesty back, and I was not in a position to give it then. She was getting wet. I was getting wet. The courtyard was empty, and the rain was the only sound. She said, I have a plant in my office. I said, I know. She said, you mentioned it in the voice message. You said that a thriving plant means consistent attention. That it means someone who remembers to take care of things. I said, I remember. She said, I named it after you sent that message. I stared at her. She said, I know that is not a normal thing to say. But you said an honest thing, and I am saying an honest thing back. I said, you named your plant. She said, I named my plant. I said, what did you name it? She said, Layla. I stood in the rain and looked at the most intimidating person I had ever met, who had named her office plant after a voice message I had sent her by accident, and I understood several things at once. I said, Dr. Malik, She said, Serena. It was the first time she had said her own first name to me. I said, Serena. She said, yes. I said, the professional situation is clear now. She said, it is. I said, and the grades are submitted. She said, they are, I said, and you are no longer my advisor. She said, I am not. I said, so there are no more rules in the way. She said, no, there are not. I stepped forward. The rain was very serious now, the kind that meant it. I said, I recorded that voice message on the train because I had been trying to explain to my best friend for 8 months that what I felt was intellectual admiration. She said, and I said, she never believed me. She said she was right. I said, I know. She said, Layla. I said, yes. She said, it is raining quite a lot. I said, I know. She said, I have been standing in it for longer than is practical. I said, me too. She looked at me with the expression that had no professional distance in it. The one that had been there underneath everything all year and had been held back by the right rules that were right rules. She was not holding it back now. I kissed her. In the rain in the courtyard on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks after my thesis defense. She kissed me back with her hands on my face and the rain coming down and the campus quiet around us. When we stopped, she looked at me. She said, you reorganized your schedule to walk past my office every morning. I said, I did. She said, I started arriving early because I knew you would. I stared at her. She said, the thriving plant required earlier watering. I said, you came in early because you knew I would walk past. She said, I noticed things too, she said. It is not only you. I said, you are. She said, what? I said, insufferable. You are insufferable, she smiled, the full one. The one I had been collecting all year. I know, she said. We went inside out of the rain. Here is what is true now. Her name is Serena. I call her that now. It still feels like something important every time. Like a door that was closed for a very long time that is now open, and I am allowed to walk through it. She still has the plant in her office. Its name is still Layla. She has not changed it. Cleo said, I told you so when I met Serena the first time. Serena said, you were right to tell her. Cleo looked at Serena for a long moment and then said, I like you. Which from Cleo is approximately equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. The thesis was published 4 months after defense. In the acknowledgement section I wrote, to SM, who told me to stop convincing and start arguing. It changed everything. She read it in the library. She looked up at me across the table. She said, everything? I said, the writing, obviously. She said, obviously, the corner of her mouth. All the way. I started a postdoctoral position in September. A different department, different building, no remaining professional connection that required any professional distance. She still makes 2 cups of tea on Thursday afternoons, not because of tutoring sessions. Just because Thursday afternoons are when I come to her office now, and she knows what kind I drink. Some things do not need to be explained. They just become part of how you are with someone. That is what this became, part of how we are. This is a story about a 63-second voice message sent to the wrong person on a Tuesday evening on a train. It is also a story about the right rules that are right rules, and the importance of following them completely, even when it is hard, until the moment you no longer have to. It is a story about a woman who named her plant and arrived early, and made 2 cups of tea, and held everything back for 8 months because the rules were right, and then said everything honestly the moment the rules were no longer in the way. Most of all, it is a story about what happens when you stop calling something intellectual admiration and finally say what it actually is. Here is my question for you. Have you ever accidentally told the truth to someone who was not supposed to hear it? Did it turn out to be the best mistake you ever made? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes the wrong send is the most right thing that ever happens to you. And if you are currently calling something intellectual admiration, you already know what it actually is.